Hello, my name is Peter Hotez, and I'm the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, where I'm also a professor of pediatrics and Texas Children's Hospital Chair for Tropical Pediatrics. And today we're going to be focusing on Zika virus infection, some of the origins of the virus, and what are the things that we need to concern us, especially regarding the possibility of Zika striking the continental United States. I think one of the important points to preface my remarks today is that we don't have a lot of information published in the biomedical literature about Zika. So this train, this hurricane, is moving so fast through the Americas that the biomedical literature is having trouble keeping up. So a lot of my remarks today, they could change in 6 months because we're basing it some on the biomedical literature, but also things that are coming through social media, emails, exchanges with colleagues, talking to thought leaders on this class of viruses. And this also highlights, I think, a problem with our whole system of biomedical literature publishing that was really developed mostly in Germany during the 19th century, where a scientist would write a paper, it would get sent to the editor, sent out for peer review, come back to the editor, get sent to the scientist again, who would revise their comments, and then this would go through several rounds, and a year later, 18 months later, the paper would be published. Well, that worked really well in Germany in the 19th century. It doesn't work nearly as well now. So we're really giving some thought to how we can hasten this process. So one of the hats that I wear, I'm also a journal editor of the Public Library of Science, Neglected Tropical Diseases, plus NTDs. And a number of us have gotten together from different journals and are feeling very comfortable now about scientists who are reporting on Zika to, at the same time they're submitting their paper for publication, to put up their article as a preprint in the bioRxiv, a preprint server managed by Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. And I don't know that it's a perfect system, but I think it tells us a lot that we may have to consider this type of model in the future, or so maybe even something better, as we deal with pandemic threats or public health emergencies. So what is Zika virus? Zika is an arbovirus. It's a virus transmitted by mosquito, and it's also a Flavivirus. It's a virus that belongs to the same positive RNA, single-stranded RNA classes of viruses as dengue, yellow fever, Japanese encephalitis, West Nile, and St. Louis encephalitis. And it's very important that one realizes that this is a virus that's transmitted first and foremost by the Aedes mosquito, particularly Aedes aegypti. And that's the same mosquito that also transmits dengue and yellow fever, but not West Nile virus. And the reason I think that's important for people to realize is because the Aedes aegypti, Aedes albopictus are specifically adapted to feeding on humans, particularly Aedes aegypti, which feeds almost exclusively on humans, lives in human habitats such as right outside the home, in discarded tires and plastic containers, in old TV sets. Aedes albopictus has a wider diversity of animals that it feeds on, other mammals and birds, but Aedes aegypti is particularly concerned because it lives in such close approximation to humans. So that on the Gulf Coast of the U.S., where we're particularly concerned about mosquitoes and viruses, we currently only spray for Culex mosquitoes, where the big trucks roll up at night and lift up a fog of insecticidal spray. That's targeting Culex mosquitoes. It's really not doing very much for Aedes aegypti. Now what happens when humans are infected with Zika virus, the virus is in the bloodstream for a short period of time, around 5 to 6 days, and that's the period when Aedes aegypti can bite humans and then subsequently infect several other individuals. So a lot of these arboviruses transmitted by Aedes aegypti are often clustered in households, and we might expect the same thing to happen with Aedes aegypti. And for other times, the virus will develop in the mosquito, and then the mosquito can then bite another another individual. So the big factors associated with Aedes aegypti are with Zika virus are having the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the crowding, and a third component I think that we're starting to see a lot with Zika is poverty, probably because of the environmental degradation that allows the Aedes aegypti virus to thrive. Now, where did Zika virus begin? We believe it began in the Zika forest of Uganda. Zika means overgrowth in a local Ugandan language. It was first found in 1947 and isolated from some non-human primates in 1952. The first human case was described in Nigeria in 1954, and this was a virus that really did not occupy a lot of the attention of the tropical disease research community. If you talked about it, you might mention it to check the box in a longer talk about dengue or yellow fever or West Nile virus, and then you would may at the end say, oh yeah, there's something called Zika. But that's all changed now, and it really began, that change began about 10 years ago. So here, as best we can tell, piecing it together, the course of where this virus has traveled. And number one, it shows you that the virus was first identified in Uganda, the first human case in Nigeria, and then during the subsequent decades it spread across through Pakistan and India, where again it did not seem to have this big epidemic or pandemic potential. Everything changed in the year 2007 and the item label number 4 when the virus reached Yap Island in Micronesia, and then roughly 75% of that island population became infected within a period of 3 months. So a very different behavior of this virus that we hadn't seen previously. And then in the number 5, in 2013, it entered into French Polynesia, and then in 6 archipelagos of French Polynesia, 90% of the island became infected over a period of a few months. So again, it took on this capacity to infect high percentages of human populations over a very short period of time. And then in number 6, what we're seeing is now 2/3 of the populations of some areas of northeastern Brazil are infected with Zika virus. So how do we explain how Zika went from a virus that did not have this explosive potential to one that did in the Pacific Islands and then subsequently in Latin America? And what I'd like to do is to go through 3 different hypotheses that may account for some of these observations to explain our current situation, where you have Zika virus in almost every Latin American country, as well as most of the Caribbean by the end of this month. And how did all that happen? Well, what we've come up with is 3 different hypotheses that could possibly explain this explosive change. And I should mention that none of them are mutually exclusive. All 3 could be going on, or 2 out of the 3. So the first hypothesis says actually Zika is not as unique as you might think. We've seen over the last few years an explosion of other arboviruses and as well as viruses and parasites transmitted by vectors, meaning insects and snails. So hypothesis number 1 says that Zika is going by the same playbook used by dengue and chikungunya, and it's in fact part of a general expansion of insect and snail transmitted diseases, not only in the Western Hemisphere and the Americas, but even in Europe and in the Middle East. So for example, let's look at the Western Hemisphere. Let's look at what's been happening with dengue, chikungunya, and Zika virus, and then we'll go into Zika virus infection. So with dengue, this was a virus that through aggressive Aedes aegypti control was eliminated through many parts of Latin America and the Caribbean by the 1960s and into 1970. And then in 1981 it was reintroduced into the Western Hemisphere, possibly through Havana and Cuba, and then over the ensuing 2 decades it spread across the Western Hemisphere. With chikungunya, that time frame was accelerated even more by the finding that chikungunya virus, also transmitted by Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, went across Africa and Asia, and then emerged in the island of St. Martin at the end of 2013, and then also spread across Latin America and the Caribbean with the same kind of pace and ferocity that we've seen with Zika virus infection. So the point is, Zika in some ways is on a continuum with what we've seen with dengue and chikungunya, wherever we have the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, certainly in Brazil and in the Americas, and even extending into the Caribbean and even up to the Gulf Coast, and we're going to come back to the Gulf Coast very soon. I would also like to point out that we've also seen some interesting things happening in Europe as well. So it's not only in the Americas that we have this concern. So for instance, we've just published in the Public Library of Science Neglected Tropical Diseases at the end of June of 2016, that over the last 5-6 years we've seen malaria come back to Greece after it's been gone for 70 years, chikungunya, dengue, West Nile virus in various areas in Portugal, Spain, Italy, and southern France. Even schistosomiasis, the classic snail-borne neglected tropical disease, is now on the island of Corsica, and Opisthochiasis in Italy. So we have to, if we are talking about the strange happenings in the Western Hemisphere, we have to recognize that equal things are happening in Southern Europe as well. Some people have questioned whether this is spillover from disease in the Middle East and North Africa, especially in the ISIS-occupied conflict zones. But what we think is that we've seen this new set of 21st century forces, sometimes linked to what I sometimes call the Anthropocene, which is the geological epoch that is now this human-driven geological epoch that's taking over from the Holocene as we move into the 21st century. And it's a combination of these forces: poverty, human migrations, conflict, urbanization, deforestation, climate change. Partially explains what's happening with dengue, chikungunya, and now Zika virus infection, but also the diseases in Southern Europe. So that's hypothesis number one, external forces driving this. The other second hypothesis, and again not mutually exclusive, is to say there's also something going on that's uniquely Zika. And our first hint of this came about from a paper that was published by a group at the University of Sao Paulo, one of the top universities in Brazil, at the end of last year, at the end of 2015, that noticed that there were mutations in a gene called the NS1 gene of the Zika virus, and it was noted that those mutations were not producing amino acid substitutions, but were affecting codon usage of the NS1 gene, and possibly that codon usage by the pandemic strains is optimized for replication in human cells, producing higher viremias and maybe increased infectivity for mosquitoes. One of the individuals that pointed this out to me was a mentor of mine, Major General Philip Russell, formerly of Walter Reed in Fort Detrick. So I think, yes, that's a genuine possibility, and it was really confirmed subsequently from an important paper that came out of Host Cell and Microbe in May of 2016, where a group based at UCLA identified nucleotide sequences in 41 strains, including 30 isolates, and again, they identified a cluster of mutations in the NS1 gene that could be affecting virus replications, including the Brazil strain. I think one of the unknown pieces to this is it's clear that there were some mutations going from the African strain to the Asian/pandemic strain and then into Brazil. I think an unknown piece that we still need to assemble together: have there been additional mutations happening as it went from Asia into the Americas? And I think that's a real possibility, because some of the clinical features we've seen with Zika in French Polynesia and Micronesia, including rates of microcephaly and Guillain-Barré, seem to be amplified in the Western Hemisphere. Again, we haven't seen the hard data published, but it's something to consider. So just some background on the NS1 gene. It looks like strains from the recent epidemic in Brazil show a number of changes in the NS1 gene. And maybe this is having a role in virus replication, in neurotropism. And just for background, the NS1 NS1 gene. We know most about it from work on dengue, that it's the gene product is a 50 kilodalton intracellular homodimeric protein that plays a pivotal role in dengue replication, and there's evidence it also plays an important role in dengue severity and pathogenesis. This is from work published in PLOS One by Dr. Silva and his colleagues. And the NS1 protein associates with organelle membranes, and in particular lipid rafts, suggesting that it's involved in signal transduction pathways. The bottom line, it's an important virulence factor. The UCLA group also pointed out that there were some interesting mutations in the pre-M protein, which are associated with structural alterations, and this may be important in virus particle secretion as well. So hypothesis 1, external forces. Hypothesis 2, something uniquely Zika. And the third hypothesis that's also out there that has some evidence, but I think there are others who have countered it as well, has to do with the phenomenon known as immune enhancement. So to understand that, with dengue virus, there are 4 serotypes: dengue 1, dengue 2, dengue 3, dengue 4. What happens is when you are exposed to infected with a previous one dengue serotype and then get a second one, the second infection is often more severe than the first. Let's say, for instance, you're infected with dengue type 1 virus. You develop both neutralizing antibodies that prevent you from getting a second dengue 1 infection, but you also develop non-neutralizing antibodies that have the ability to facilitate virus entry through the Fc receptor if you get a second infection. Well, there's some thinking that the possibility that previous dengue may also be increasing susceptibility to Zika virus infection. When we look at the genetic similarity between Zika and dengue, it's not all that similar. You can draw various diagrams, evolutionary diagrams, but it's definitely a hypothesis out there. So those are the 3 major hypotheses. I think the other so let's now turn our attention to beyond the epidemic nature of Zika to some of the clinical features of Zika. So Zika produces a clinical syndrome that could be similar to other arbovirus infections, which is fever, maculopapular rash that's often slightly raised and confluent, at least in the people that I've seen with Zika, headache, conjunctivitis. One thing about the rash, it could be slightly raised and red and angry looking and confluent. It's also intensely itchy, which is more so than some of the other arbovirus infections. So that might be a bit of a tip-off that it's Zika as opposed to something else. Also, in some patients that have been here in the Texas Medical Center, they also have a viral enanthem as well as exanthem. So exanthem is an external rash. Enanthem, they have ulcerative disease in their mouth as well. So people with Zika are very uncomfortable. It's not pleasant, usually not sick enough to require hospitalization, but it is an uncomfortable illness. We're also hearing a lot about the fact that maybe up to 80% of people with Zika are without symptoms. I don't know if that's going to hold up as we look at this virus in the Western Hemisphere. I know this has been described from Asia, but from everything we've seen so far, that 80% asymptomatic number may not necessarily be holding up. So this is one of those fluid things that as the more and more gets published, we'll be hearing more about. So what happens when you become infected with Zika? You get bitten by an Aedes aegypti mosquito. That then injects the virus. I'm showing you an example of dengue, and I think there are a lot of similarities between the natural history of dengue and Zika. So you go through an incubation period of 3 to 7 days, and then after that, the virus enters your bloodstream. You enter a period of what's called viremia, when you have virus in your blood, and then it's during this period, labeled in red here, when you're symptomatic, when you have fever, when you have rash. And then subsequently, most of the time, you develop an antibody response. You started with an IgM response or an IgG response, and then you neutralize the virus. And I think that's what happens in most people with Zika. They get a short-lived illness lasting anywhere from roughly a week and a half to 2 weeks, and then they mount an antibody response, and then you're subsequently cured of the virus and potentially immune to further virus infections. But we're also seeing some other unusual things happening with Zika. We find that Zika has the ability to go into other bodily fluids in addition to blood. It's been recovered from urine and saliva and even semen of men. So we're concerned about the possibility of sexual transmission from men to women, and it's probably happening in the later stages of the acute illness. I do not think we're looking at a situation like has been reported with Ebola. A lot of people are often conflating Ebola with Zika virus infection. I do not think we're looking at a situation where people are shedding virus for months and months and months, like has been reported for Ebola. I think that's probably a rare event. So I think sexual transmission does occur. I don't know how common it is. I still think it's relatively rare relative to vector transmission, but we're still getting our arms around the course of this epidemic. We do have this unusual finding in Brazil that women are being infected more than men on a ratio of 2 to 1, and some people have attributed that to sexual transmission of Zika from man to woman. I think that's a possibility, but also you have to remember if you're a woman and concerned about the possibility of being pregnant and being infected with Zika, your healthcare seeking behavior is going to go way up. So I think that probably accounts for a lot of that observation. Now what we're also seeing are people with Zika. A small percentage of them are going on to develop what's known as Guillain-Barré Syndrome. Guillain-Barré Syndrome is not unique to Zika. It happens with other viral infections, and it occurs in response when you make an antibody to the virus, and that virus will cross-react to a glycolipid that's in the myelin sheath that coats peripheral nerves, and it causes a demyelinating disease that can be associated with nerve tingling, sensations in the arms and legs, muscle weakness, loss of reflexes, and in severe cases even can paralyze the respiratory muscles and require you to be intubated. It looks as though in the French Polynesia epidemic, the rate of Guillain-Barré syndrome was 1 in 1,000 cases. I think it may be a little higher in the Western Hemisphere, but we'll have to see how those numbers look. The other thing about this virus is it's so neurotropic that it's particularly targeting the cells of the nervous system that it's given me pause to think that could Guillain-Barré syndrome be happening by an alternative pathophysiologic mechanism beyond autoimmunity, and we can come back to that. But of course what we're most concerned about is this horrific congenital birth defect, which is generally being called microcephaly, but for reasons I'll discuss, I prefer to call it fetal brain disruption sequence. It was noted last year that there was this big clustering of cases in northeastern Brazil, in Pernambuco, Paraíba State, Salvador de Bahia, and microcephaly is defined as having 2 to 3 standard deviations below the mean in head circumference. And that's what concerns us that we're seeing. We're also seeing some stillbirths as well. The evidence that microcephaly is linked to Zika was first discovered by Brazilian scientists who did some amazing work showing that you can identify the genome of the Zika virus in the amniotic fluid of mothers who by ultrasound had babies with microcephaly, and then isolating it from the blood and other tissues of newborns with microcephaly. And then the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC in the United States, found that you could also recover Zika genome in the placentas of 2 women who miscarried. So I think the link between microcephaly and Zika virus is pretty firm. So these are some of the early pictures that we saw of babies with microcephaly. One of the arrows in this picture on the right are one of the early fetal ultrasounds, and I think what I'm trying to show you here is that these white, small white punctate marks are what are called calcifications. The reason that's important is from other congenital infections such as cytomegalovirus infection or toxoplasmosis. We also see calcifications, and this is confirmatory evidence that we're looking at a congenital virus infections. But for me, some of the most chilling photographs came out at the beginning of 2016, published in Ultrasound and Obstetrics and Gynecology by Oliveira and his colleagues. And what was concerning was these big dilated ventricles in the brain where the brain should be, and so that what was left of the brain was a fine rim of cortical tissue. And the basis for this virus we think we may have an idea about from work done by groups at Johns Hopkins and Florida State University, who found that the virus is specifically affecting the neural progenitor cells, the stem cells that give rise to the fetal brain, essentially blocking the development of the fetal brain, as well as causing hypoplasia of the cerebellum and corpus callosum. So this is why this disease is so devastating. It's not just a small head, it's largely absent brain matter, brain tissue. So really every parent's worst nightmare. And so these are some of the later MRI pictures that have come out from Guillemette Arthur and his colleagues in pediatric radiology, again showing ventricular megaly, diffuse polymicrogyra, and laminar necrosis of the cortex. So really a horrific brain defect. The reason I'd like to call it fetal brain disruption sequence is to really strike home the fact that it's really causing neurological devastation. The term was really first well developed by two pediatricians, Moore and Weaver, published in the Journal of Pediatrics in 1990. Not necessarily Zika, but it really describes it well. And the fetal brain disruption sequence is a recognizable pattern of defects that includes moderate to profound microcephaly, overlapping sutures, occipital bone prominence, and scalp rugae. And I think this is the most important part. The condition is postulated to arise from partial fetal brain disruption with subsequent fetal skull collapse resulting from decreased intracranial hydrostatic pressure. Essentially what it's saying is in the absence of any brain development, there's nothing to maintain hydrostatic pressure in the skull cavity, and as a result the skull basically implodes around the absence of brain. So again, I really can't think of a worse, more diabolical birth defect. Now back then in 1990, more than 20 years ago, the proposed causes include prenatal viral or parasitic infections. They suggest maybe it was occurring from second and third trimester insults, but we're really starting to see a situation where most of the Zika microcephaly and fetal brain disruption sequence is most likely from first trimester infections. We also have pointed out, and I've recently published this in a paper in an article in JAMA Pediatrics, that even a microcephaly and fetal brain disruption sequence aside, this virus is so neurotropic that it's quite possible that there's other neurologic manifestations, even in babies that don't have microcephaly and fetal brain disruption sequence. So I think this is going to occupy the activities of a generation of pediatric neurologists and infectious disease experts to sort out what are some of the other devastating consequences of maternal infection due to Zika for the unborn baby. And so that's problem one. I think even afterwards, after the baby's born in the first year of life, we know there's a lot of brain development afterwards. What's going to be the consequence of Zika virus for infants? So I think this is going to take us years to sort out. It's going to occupy a generation of pediatric subspecialists. Very much reminds me of when I was taking care of pediatric Aedes babies during the 1990s back when I was at Yale. You know, this required a lot of collaboration between neuroscientists, infectious disease experts. I think the same thing is going to be true of Zika for this devastating epidemic in the Americas that the World Health Organization is saying is going to reach 4 million people. So what's happening now? So Zika now has entered into Brazil, it's moved into Colombia and Venezuela, and now it's starting to move into Central America. Honduras is getting hit very hard, and then in the Caribbean. So what we've seen are, as I've indicated, the three factors that I've noticed is having the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the crowding, and the poverty. So why did this epidemic hit northeastern Brazil so hard? Well, I think you could take a look at the major cities in northeastern Brazil, Recife and Salvador de Bahia. There's the crowding, there's the effects of poverty, where there's standing water, where you have low-income housing without air conditioning and absent window screens. allowing the mosquitoes to go in. These mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, only fly about 50 to 100 meters. So I think all of those factors are associated with the explosive epidemic in northeastern Brazil. I should also mention that northeastern Brazil is basically home to a lot of neglected tropical diseases in the Americas. So it has some of the highest concentrations traditionally of lymphatic filariasis, of leishmaniasis, of schistosomiasis. So it's not just Zika in northeastern Brazil, it's a host of other neglected tropical diseases, as we call them, NTDs. I'm very worried about Haiti because, again, you're going to have the same confluence of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes crowding in poverty in cities like Port-au-Prince. So far, it hasn't really, we don't think it's really panned out. We haven't seen huge numbers. On the other hand, Haiti has such a depleted health system. As I talk to my colleagues such as Louise Ivers or Paul Farmer, Partners in Health, the health system and infrastructure is so profoundly depleted. Could it be that Zika is hitting Haiti very hard, but yet no one's looking because of the absence of health systems in that country? We know Puerto Rico is getting hit very hard. Again, it's mostly the impoverished areas that I'm quite worried about. As I say, it's going by the same YAP playbook. So I'm very worried about Puerto Rico. The CDC is saying a quarter of the population is infected. We're already looking at dozens, if not hundreds, of pregnant women with Zika virus in Puerto Rico. I'm very worried, and this absolutely has to occupy our full attention right now. We cannot let our friends in Puerto Rico down, as in some ways we're already doing. Okay, what about the United States, the continental United States? Well, as I remind you, we do have Aedes aegypti. This is a map from Simon Hayes' group at Oxford University, who's also at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington, and he appropriately points out this focus of Aedes aegypti along the Gulf Coast. There's also foci in Tucson, Arizona, and a few, and as my colleague Amy Morrison points out, in Southern California as well. I think we have to consider that these are at-risk areas, particularly in our urban centers, because crowding is an important factor. So in addition to Tucson, I'm worried about Houston, Galveston, New Orleans, Tallahassee, Tampa, Miami, and Orlando to some extent. These are the areas I'm worried where Zika is going to hit hard, particularly in the poor neighborhoods. Let's not forget about poverty. If you come from the Northeast, as I have, until we moved down here to start the National School of Tropical Medicine 5 years ago, I really didn't appreciate the depth of poverty that's on the Gulf Coast. But you can go into some of the poor neighborhoods of Houston, and it looks like a little bit of Pernambuco State right here in the continental U.S. So this is Houston's historic Fifth Ward, which was started in 1865 by freed slaves, and now is one of the historic African-American neighborhoods in Houston. And you go into some of the poor areas of the Fifth Ward, you can again find houses with no window screens, discarded tires, you find plastic containers, discarded TV sets, all of the conditions that you need for Zika transmission. So I am worried about the poor neighborhoods of our urban areas on the Gulf Coast. I'm worried for New Orleans, I'm worried for Galveston, I'm worried for Corpus Christi, I'm worried for Brownsville, I'm worried for Tampa, Miami, Orlando. These are places where we have to be hyper-vigilant about Zika. So this is also from Simon Hayes' group, who confirms his group's feelings that this is an area at risk for Zika. This is a map reconstructed by the New York Times for Aedes aegypti that was based on Simon Hayes' data, and I think these are the urban areas that concern me the most. This is an article that I wrote for the New York Times expressing my fears that Zika is coming to the Gulf Coast. So what do we do with diagnostic information? Right now, if you go on the CDC website, so much of the diagnostic information for men and for women or pregnant women is based on if you're traveling to an endemic area. I think one of the big questions in the U.S. is, what if the Gulf Coast becomes an endemic area? How will that affect it? So the information for a man is, if you're infected, to wait as a safety period 6 months before having unprotected sex, or if not, wait 8 weeks if you're traveling to an endemic area, this is all fluid. This could change depending as we learn more. We're still on a steep learning curve about this virus. Or if you're a woman planning on becoming pregnant, to wait 8 weeks if you're in an endemic area. One of the big questions that asked by women who are pregnant or planning on becoming pregnant all the time in Houston is, what should we do now? And that's a difficult question to address. I'm concerned about Zika transmission on the Gulf Coast, and it's very reasonable to consider delaying pregnancy during these summer months, if you can, until we know historically Zika, arbovirus infections go down. So at least on the Gulf Coast, the typical pattern that we see is they begin, if you look at dengue in Houston in 2003, or if you look at what West Nile virus has been doing the last few years, it starts in June, peaks in July and August, and continues into September. This is the risk period that I'm worried about the most regarding Zika. All right, so what are we doing about controlling Zika? Well, the concept of eradicating Aedes aegypti was pioneered a long time ago. So Fred Soper, who was one of the founders of the Pan American Health Organization back in the 1930s for yellow fever and dengue control, did an enormous amount of work showing the impact of going house to house to getting rid of standing water and to do spraying. He also was focused on malaria eradication. And then, based on his legacy during the late 1940s and moving into the 1960s, the then Pan American Sanitary Bureau, now the Pan American Health Organization, pioneered this concept of Aedes aegypti eradication, going house to house in a military-style campaign to get rid of Aedes aegypti. And it worked. They actually got rid of Aedes aegypti in 18 Latin American countries in an effort to dramatically lower incidence rates of dengue and yellow fever. So it was highly effective. So here's what happened. There's the 1930s. This is showing where Aedes aegypti is. And this is from a paper we recently published in PLOS NTDs, and the figure was reproduced from Dwayne Gubler and his colleagues. And it shows that by 1970s in 18 Latin American countries, we had eradicated it. Interestingly, in the Gulf Coast of the United States, the U.S. largely refused to play. There were some fledgling efforts that began in 1965, halted in 1969, but we've never really embarked on Aedes aegypti control on the Gulf Coast. To the point where my colleagues tell me that during the 70s, the Latin American countries were claiming that they were becoming reinfested from Aedes aegypti from mosquitoes coming from the Gulf Coast, in part due to the used tire trade. Now, whether that was responsible for the reemergence of Aedes aegypti or dengue, we don't really know. There was also lapses in vigilance by a lot of the Latin American governments. But the reason I provide this historic example is to say that we've really never aggressively pursued Aedes aegypti control on the Gulf Coast. As a result, we don't have the experience to know how to do this. If we decide to begin Aedes aegypti control, we're going to be, again, on a very steep learning curve figuring out how to do it. It's highly intrusive. It means going house to house, getting rid of a solid waste that might breed Aedes aegypti mosquito eggs. It also sometimes means doing insecticidal spraying in and around the house. The mosquito trucks aren't going to do this. And it often will violate cultural norms of privacy. So we're going to be in for a long, hard summer figuring out what the next steps are going to be. There are some innovative technologies out there. One of them are the genetically modified mosquitoes from Oxitec, which is a company based out of Oxford University, hence the name, where they produce genetically altered males. They've shown some interesting pilot studies in Brazil and elsewhere in terms of lowering numbers of Aedes aegypti. The problem is these studies are mostly smaller studies. They've not really been tested at full scale. And we don't really know what the impact's going to be on preventing disease. So I think that's a long way of saying I don't think the genetically modified mosquitoes are going to make a big impact on this current epidemic if it moves throughout the Western Hemisphere as it seems to be doing, especially on the Gulf Coast of the U.S. It's an interesting technology, one that we'll continue to watch, but for now we're going to have to rely on old-fashioned Aedes aegypti control methods. And same with a Zika vaccine. I think there's a lot of excitement around different technologies for Zika vaccines. One of the things that we do at the National School of Tropical Medicine is we brought with us the Sabin Vaccine Institute in collaboration with Texas Children's Hospital for neglected disease vaccines. I think we're going to move very quickly into phase 1 trials for a number of different platform vaccines, including some of them listed here. But then I think things are really going to slow down. And the reason is because of some of the safety concerns. One, we know that Zika virus causes Guillain-Barré syndrome. We're going to need to show that any of the candidate vaccines also does not cause Guillain-Barré syndrome. That's going to take us time to sort out. We're also going to be concerned about the fact that this is a vaccine that ideally we'd give to women who are pregnant or about to become pregnant, which is about the highest bar there is in terms of regulatory hurdle, so that the FDA is going to have to make some difficult decisions. But I think it's the safety concerns between Guillain-Barré and use in pregnancy are going to be so dominant that I don't think we're going to have a Zika vaccine in time for this epidemic. I think we'll move quickly into phase 1, but then things are not going to move much beyond that. So again, we're left with Aedes aegypti control. My big worry is that we're already starting to see Zika transmission on the Gulf Coast, because we know this is the time of the year it begins for arbovirus infections, but that nobody's looking because nobody has the funds to look. So I'm sorry to end on that very sobering note. We've got a lot of work ahead of us this summer, and thank you for taking the time to listen.